Good morning, everybody. And what you're looking at right here is smoke curling off a border crossing between Iran and Iraq, a place called Shalamcheh, hit just hours ago in what is now the 12th consecutive night of American strikes on Iran. But today isn't just about another night of bombs. Today is about the line that both sides have been dancing around for months, the line that everybody's been afraid to actually cross, and that line is bridges and power plants. Because just yesterday, a senior Iranian military official came out and said that if the Americans hit an Iranian bridge or an Iranian power plant, Iran will respond by striking infrastructure and bridges all across the region, including energy facilities where the United States has interests. That's a direct threat, on the record, from Tehran, and it's a threat that only exists because President Trump has been promising for months that if Iran doesn't get back to the table and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the bridges and the power plants are exactly what's getting hit next. So today we're breaking down how we got to this exact moment, what's already been hit along the way, what the targeting logic actually looks like for hitting a bridge versus hitting a radar site, and why the single threat from Tehran might be the most revealing thing they've said in this entire war. So let's rewind the tape a little, because this bridges and power plants conversation didn't start this week. It's been sitting in the background of this whole conflict since the spring, when Trump first floated hitting Iranian power plants and bridges if the strait remained closed, and he wasn't shy about the language either, warning that the whole civilization would feel it if that waterway didn't open back up. Back then, we saw a preview of exactly what this looks like when it's actually carried out. The Karaj B1 bridge, which is the tallest bridge anywhere in the Middle East and one of the main western corridors out of Tehran, got hit and hit again in early April. A highway bridge linking Tabriz to Zanjan up in the north also got taken out. A railway bridge near Kashan in central Iran was struck too, and that one actually killed people standing near the structure when it went down. So when people ask me, is this a new escalation, hitting bridges? The answer is no, this has already happened before. What's new is that we are now back in that exact same conversation, except this time it's happening after 12 straight nights of strikes instead of a single deadline day. And this time, Iran is publicly promising to hit the whole region back if Washington follows through again. And follow through is basically what's already been happening. Just this past week, the United States expanded its strike package to include more bridges, more energy sites, and it also collapsed a tower at one of Iran's key ports. Those bridge strikes were aimed specifically at cutting Bandar Abbas, which is Iran's main port, off from the roads and rail lines that lead into it. So this is not just symbolic damage. This is surgical economic strangulation. You take out the bridge, you take out the highway and the railway that connect the port to the rest of the country. And now whatever's sitting at that port has nowhere to go. Meanwhile, on the other side of this exchange, Kuwait reported severe damage to its own power grid and told its civilians to start rationing electricity after a wave of Iranian retaliatory attacks. And Iran claimed that the United States struck a desalination plant that was supplying water to thousands of people. Reports out of Iran say that around 10,000 people across 20 villages had their water supply disrupted because of that strike. So both sides are now hitting the kind of infrastructure that keeps ordinary people's lights on and taps running, and that's exactly the escalation ladder that international law experts have been warning about for months, saying strikes like this raise real questions about the laws of war. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to pretend to be one, but I will tell you, as someone who's flown these kinds of missions, targeteers do not take infrastructure strikes lightly, and there's a reason bridges get treated as dual-use targets rather than just being lumped in with a random office building. And it's worth sitting with that Kashan railway bridge detail for a second longer, because that strike from back in April is the clearest example of why this target set is so politically radioactive. Casualty reports from that stretch of strikes on Iranian bridges put the death toll somewhere between 8 and 13 people, with roughly 95 more wounded, and a chunk of those casualties were civilians who happened to be gathered underneath the structure when it came down. That's the exact scenario international law experts keep pointing to when they raise concerns about strikes on dual-use infrastructure, because a bridge doesn't check identification before people walk under it. So every time this conversation about bridges and power plants comes back around, it's not an abstract military planning exercise, it's a decision with a body count attached to it from the very first time it was tried. Here's the thing about bridges as a target set that most people watching this at home don't think about. A bridge isn't just a bridge. In targeting terms, it's a choke point. If you take out the right bridge at the right time, you don't just stop civilian traffic, you stop military resupply, you stop fuel trucks, you stop whatever's moving ballistic missile components from a production site to a launch site. That's why, in this exact war, we've already watched bridges connecting Tehran to Mashhad get taken off the map, cutting a rail corridor that runs all the way through Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan into Russia and China. That corridor is how Iran was getting components smuggled in to keep their military machine fed during a war where they're bleeding stockpiles fast. So when people ask, why on earth would the US bomb a bridge? My answer is always the same. Because that bridge was never just carrying commuters, it was carrying the war effort. Iran actually has a track record here too that tells you how seriously they take this specific threat category. Back when the first round of these bridge and power plant warnings went out, Iranian officials publicly urged young people to physically form human chains around power plants to try to shield them, which is about as clear a signal as you can get that they believe those facilities are genuinely at risk and that they don't have a purely military answer to defending them. You don't ask civilians to stand under a target unless you're worried the target is actually going to get hit and you've run out of better options. And on the flip side, we've watched Iran's president at various points claim that millions of ordinary citizens have volunteered to fight if the war escalates to that level, which tells you the regime is trying to build a narrative of total civilian mobilization. At the exact same time, it's fielding drones and missiles against tankers and Gulf neighbors. Two different messages aimed at two different audiences, one for their own population and one for the outside world, running at the same time. Power plants work a little differently, but the logic rhymes. You take out a power plant, and you're not just turning off somebody's air conditioning in July heat. Although that's part of it, and it's brutal, temperatures out there have been sitting well past 100 degrees this month. You're also taking out the ability to run air defense radars, to run command and control nodes, to keep water treatment and desalination plants online, which is exactly why Kuwait's power and water desalination plant getting damaged in this exchange was such a big deal regionally. Everybody downstream of the electrical grid feels a strike like that, and that's the entire point of Iran's threat yesterday. They're not just saying, we'll hit you back. They're saying we'll hit the region back, meaning Gulf allies, meaning energy infrastructure with American interests attached to it, which is their way of putting every single country hosting a U.S. base or a U.S. energy contract on notice. It's also worth remembering how we even got back to a shooting war in the first place, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. Major combat operations were first announced back in late February, with massive joint strikes from the United States and Israel hitting military, government, and infrastructure sites all across Iran in one coordinated opening move. That eventually gave way to negotiations in June, with delegations from both countries sitting down around a memorandum of understanding that was supposed to be the actual roadmap to ending things, centered heavily on reopening and guaranteeing safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. For a little while, it looked like that framework might hold, and then it didn't. The two sides started accusing each other of violating the spirit of that agreement. The strait kept closing and reopening depending on who you asked that week. And by early July, the whole thing had unraveled into exactly the kind of tit-for-tat exchange we're still living through right now. So when people ask me, why does it feel like this war keeps almost ending and then restarting? It's because that's literally the pattern. Ceasefire, memorandum, collapse, escalation, repeat. And every time it restarts, the target list creeps a little further into infrastructure that wasn't on the table the time before. Now let's talk about how we got to night 12 of this campaign, because the sequencing actually tells a story all by itself. This current stretch of fighting reignited after peace talks between Washington and Tehran collapsed over a memorandum of understanding that was supposed to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. Once those talks broke down, night after night of strikes started rolling in, and CENTCOM has been consistent about what they're targeting each time, describing hits on Iranian military command centers, air defense and coastal surveillance sites, maritime capabilities, missile and drone launch sites, and communications networks, all in an effort to keep Iran from being able to threaten commercial shipping through the strait. On the ninth night of that campaign, we saw strikes roll through Bushehr, Tabriz, Urmia, Bandar Imam Khomeini, Jask, Sirik, Mashhar, Chabahar, and Konarak, all in one overnight wave, with at least one person confirmed dead in Tabriz, according to local officials. That's 9 different Iranian cities and towns getting hit in a single night, and that's the kind of tempo that tells you this isn't a one-off strike package anymore. This is sustained operational pressure, night after night after night. And Iran hasn't been sitting quiet through any of this. Kuwait's military put out a statement saying its air defenses were actively confronting hostile drone attacks, and Bahrain sounded air raid sirens more than once in a single morning. So while the corporate press likes to frame this as America bombing Iran in isolation, what's actually happening is a two-way exchange across the entire Gulf, with Iran using drones and missiles to hit at Gulf partners hosting American assets, and the U.S. pushing back with air power aimed at degrading Iran's ability to keep doing that. The United States has also been reinforcing the theater in a serious way. F-16s stationed in Germany and F-35 fighters stationed in the United Kingdom have been sent into the Middle East to backstop this fight. And there are now roughly 50,000 American troops in the region supporting this campaign. That's not a light footprint. That's a signal that Washington is settling in for a longer fight, if that's what it takes. Unfortunately, this fight has not been free for American forces either. Nearly 100 American service members have suffered some level of injury since the 7th of July, and the vast majority of those were described as minor concussions, with the overwhelming majority of those troops back on duty within days. But not everyone made it back. Multiple service members have been killed in recent strikes tied to bases in Jordan and Iraq. The Pentagon has had to formally identify those losses one at a time as the picture became clear. That's the human cost sitting underneath every one of these dramatic explosion clips you see online. And it's worth remembering that even as we talk tactics and hardware. Which brings us to the retaliation angle that's been heating up specifically around that Jordan basing question. The Revolutionary Guards put out a statement just hours ago claiming that attacks on American military bases in Jordan were a legitimate response to what they call repeated American attacks on Iranian territory. And they went even further, claiming they destroyed a U.S. THAAD missile defense radar, a Patriot air defense system, a C-RAM counter-rocket radar, fuel storage tanks, and helicopter maintenance facilities at that base. Whether every piece of that claim holds up under scrutiny is a different conversation, but the messaging is loud and clear. They're framing American bases sitting on partner nation soil as occupied territory that they consider fair game, while simultaneously saying they respect Jordan's sovereignty, which is a pretty contradictory position to hold at the same time, but that's rhetoric for you. Iran's own military spokesperson also said this week that if the United States keeps hitting infrastructure and coastal areas in the country's south, Iran will adopt what he called new measures, and that their retaliatory operations are entering a new phase. So that, combined with yesterday's specific bridges and power plants, threat tells me Tehran is trying to draw a red line in public before the U.S. crosses it again, which usually means they're worried the U.S. is about to cross it again. And last night gives you a preview of exactly that pattern continuing. The strike on the Shalamcheh border crossing between Iran and Iraq killed at least 2 people and wounded 11 more, marking the 12th straight night of American bombing. In the same news cycle, Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed a tanker caught fire in the Strait of Hormuz. And separately, Yemen's Houthis claimed missile and drone strikes against 2 Saudi oil tankers over in the Red Sea. So you've now got parallel maritime harassment campaigns running simultaneously in 2 different waterways that carry a massive share of the world's oil, the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea, both lit up with attacks in the same 48-hour window. CENTCOM has also confirmed it redirected 9 ships and disabled 1 vessel as part of enforcement around the ongoing blockade of Iran, which tells you the naval side of this fight is still very much alive. Even while the air campaign grabs most of the headlines, explosions have also been reported overnight in Sirik, in Avaz, and in Bushehr, adding to a strike map that, according to independent conflict trackers, now shows the United States has hit Iran at least 120 times since the 8th of July alone, with Iranian officials claiming at least 50 people killed and more than 500 wounded from that stretch of the campaign. 17 American service members have been confirmed killed since this phase of the war reignited, which puts a real number on what everyone's calling a degrade campaign from the outside. Now, let's talk a little about what's actually flying to make all of this happen, because I've weaponeered missions like this myself, and there's a reason the platforms matter as much as the targets. When you're going after something like a bridge, you're not necessarily reaching for a bunker buster. Bridges get taken down efficiently with precision-guided standoff weapons, things launched from a safe distance that can drop a span with surgical accuracy instead of just cratering the surrounding area. The F-15E Strike Eagle is a workhorse for this kind of tasking because it can carry a mixed loadout, precision-guided bombs for structural targets like bridges and power infrastructure. And it's got the range and payload flexibility to be retasked mid-mission if something more important pops up on the sensor feed. Pair that with F-16 CJs doing the suppression of enemy air defenses work up front, using anti-radiation missiles to make sure Iranian radar operators can't safely turn their systems on without painting a target on themselves. And you've got the same layered strike package we've seen play out over and over this year. Suppress, then strike, then confirm. For a power plant, the calculus shifts slightly because you're usually looking at a larger, more hardened facility, sometimes with its own air defense ring around it if it's tied to a military or dual-use grid. That's where standoff cruise missiles come into play, things like the Extended Range Joint Air to Surface Standoff Missile that can be launched from well outside the threat envelope, from an F-15E, from a B-1 Lancer, sometimes even from ships and submarines carrying naval variants. The B-1, in particular, can carry a mind-blowing number of these missiles per aircraft. And a 2-ship formation of B-1s can put dozens of precision-guided weapons on target in a single pass without ever crossing into contested airspace. That's the kind of strike package you'd expect to see if the actual power plant and bridge campaign that's being threatened right now finally gets the green light, instead of just staying a warning on Truth Social and in Tasnim quotes. And there's a reason you'd want that particular platform mix, rather than sending manned fighters low and slow over a defended power complex. A hardened power station tied into a national grid is usually going to have its own point defense, whether that's older Iranian surface-to-air systems or mobile short-range interceptors moved in specifically to protect critical infrastructure once a threat like this becomes public. Standoff weapons let you take the shot from outside all of that without ever putting a pilot inside the threat ring, and that matters even more right now given how many American service members have already been hurt or killed in this exact conflict. Nobody wants to trade a Strike Eagle and its crew for a transformer yard, when a cruise missile launched from 200 miles out can do the exact same job with zero risk to the person pulling the trigger. I've flown enough of these profiles to tell you that the boring answer is usually the right one when it comes to hardened infrastructure. It's not about finding some clever trick weapon, it's about stacking suppression first, standoff weapon second, and battle damage assessment third, then deciding whether a second pass is even necessary. That's the same rhythm we've watched play out on every single one of these strike packages all year. Coastal radar first, command node second, now creeping toward bridges and power infrastructure as the next logical rung on the ladder if this keeps going the way it's been going. And let's not overlook the mountain in the room here either. Trump has repeatedly referenced a site that's been nicknamed Pickaxe Mountain, describing it as primed for what he called a big fat shot, and that's widely understood to be shorthand for the 30,000-pound bunker buster, the same class of weapon that already got used earlier this year against other hardened Iranian sites. That's a completely different animal from bridges and power plants. That's a deeply buried facility that needs the heaviest penetrator in the American arsenal, and almost certainly a B-2 stealth bomber to deliver it, flying all the way from Missouri, dropping ordnance and flying home without ever really being seen. So when people ask me, is the bridges and power plants threat the scariest thing on the table right now? My answer is actually no, because Pickaxe Mountain is still sitting there in reserve, and everybody in this conflict knows it. Let's take a quick break, because I want to tell you about something I'm genuinely proud of. I've spent a long time flying strike missions and studying how military strategy actually works under pressure. The kind of decision-making you have to do in real time when the plan you walked out to the jet with is not the plan you're executing 30 seconds after you cross the fence. I put everything I learned about adapting on the fly, about reading an opponent, about knowing exactly when to escalate and when to hold back, into a book that breaks down how those same principles apply to business, to leadership, and to your own personal life. If you've ever felt like you're stuck reacting instead of leading, that book walks through the exact same decision trees that show up in a cockpit and shows you how to use them anywhere. You can find the pre-order link in the description below, and if you order now, you can still get a signed copy while supplies last. I really do appreciate every one of you who's picked one up so far. And I also want to mention, for anyone who's ever pulled a long shift, whether that's in a cockpit or behind a desk, I put a lot of thought into a clean energy option built around avoiding that crash you get 30 minutes after a normal energy drink kicks in. Natural caffeine, some nootropics thrown in for focus, no junk ingredients weighing you down. It's in production now, and if you sign up through the link in the description, you'll be the first to know when it ships along with some merch that's coming out alongside it. Totally free to join that list, and you'll also get a weekly rundown of everything happening in this conflict, so you never miss a strike package or a diplomatic twist. All right, let's get back into it, because there's a global roundup you're going to want to hear. Before we wrap this one up, first, over in the broader region, the maritime picture keeps getting messier by the day. With the Houthis now claiming strikes on Saudi tankers in the Red Sea at the same time Iran's claiming a tanker fire in the Strait of Hormuz, you're looking at two of the most important oil choke points on the planet, both experiencing attacks in practically the same news cycle. That's the kind of correlated pressure that tends to move energy markets even when neither government wants to formally call it a full-blown crisis. Second, on the diplomatic side, there have been renewed public calls from international mediators arguing that there's no better way to end this than through diplomacy, which is true in the abstract, but becomes a lot harder to execute when one side is threatening regional infrastructure strikes, and the other side has a stealth bomber loaded with bunker busters sitting in reserve. Third, keep an eye on Jordan, because between the missile strikes at Al Azraq earlier this year and the Guard's claims of destroying air defense assets there just this week, that base has become one of the most contested single locations in this entire war, and any further incident there could easily become the next flashpoint that pulls headlines away from the strait entirely. Fourth, watch the energy markets over the next few trading sessions, because every time this conflict adds a new front, whether that's a tanker fire in Hormuz or a Houthi strike in the Red Sea, you tend to see a short-term spike in crude prices followed by a partial retracement once traders decide the flow of oil hasn't actually been meaningfully interrupted yet. That pattern is held for months now, but there's always a point where enough disruption stacks up that the market stops shrugging it off. And with two major waterways getting hit in the same week, we may be getting closer to that point than people realize. And fifth, don't sleep on the diplomatic noise coming out of Gulf capitals themselves. Kuwait and Bahrain have both been on the receiving end of this exchange, without being the ones who actually started it, and the more their own infrastructure gets damaged in the crossfire, the more pressure builds on Washington and Tehran alike to find some kind of off-ramp before a third-party country ends up dragging its own grievances into the middle of what's supposed to be a two-sided fight. So let's get into the 40,000-foot strategic analysis, because this is where all these pieces actually click together. Iran's public threat about bridges and power plants isn't really a threat about bridges and power plants. It's a signal about what they think their own vulnerability actually is. When a country stands up and specifically warns you not to hit their bridges and their power stations, what they're really telling you is that they know those targets are soft. They know they're already stretched thin, trying to defend military sites, coastal radar, missile storage, and command centers all at once. And they know that if the campaign expands into civilian-adjacent infrastructure, their ability to keep the lights on, the water running, and the economy limping along collapses even faster than their military does. That's why this warning came with a regional flavor attached, threatening energy facilities with American interests across the wider Gulf, because Tehran knows it cannot match the United States target for target inside its own borders. So the only leverage it has left is threatening to make the pain regional instead of contained. At the same time, you have to read Washington's side of this the same way. Trump floated bridges and power plants as a threat back in the spring, and by summer it had already partially happened, with the Karaj Bridge and the Tabriz-Zanjan corridor both getting hit. Now, months later, after 12 consecutive nights of strikes, after the Bandar Abbas port road and rail bridges getting cut, after Kuwait's grid taking damage in the crossfire, we are right back at that same threshold, except now there's an actual public statement from Iran acknowledging that threshold exists and telling the world what will happen if it gets crossed again. That's not something they would say unless they genuinely believed the next round of American strikes was coming for exactly those targets. So my read on where this goes next is that we're likely to see a continuation of the current pattern: coastal sites, missile and drone infrastructure, command and control nodes continuing to take the bulk of the direct hits, while bridges and power plants remain the threat sitting just behind that front line, used more as leverage in the information war and in the negotiating room than as a nightly target set, right up until the moment either side decides the leverage isn't working anymore. And if that moment comes, given everything Pickaxe Mountain represents and given how quickly this conflict has shown itself willing to expand its target list once a red line gets crossed once, I don't think a full bridges and power plants campaign, hitting them systematically rather than incidentally, is off the table at all. It is sitting right there, loaded, waiting for the next provocation to justify pulling the trigger on it fully. There's one more layer to this that I think gets lost in a lot of the coverage, and that's the internal politics inside Iran itself. Every time this war escalates, you see a slightly different set of officials stepping up to the microphone. Sometimes it's the Revolutionary Guards making the statement. Sometimes it's an army spokesperson. Sometimes it's an unnamed senior military official talking through a semi-official news agency instead of putting a name and a face on the threat. That pattern of unnamed sourcing tells you something too, because when a government is fully unified and confident, they tend to put their most senior person on camera to deliver the warning directly. When you see threats routed through anonymous officials and state-linked wire services instead, that usually means there's some internal disagreement about how far to actually go, and everybody involved wants deniability in case the threat doesn't get carried out or gets walked back entirely. So watch who's talking, not just what they're saying, because the messenger tells you almost as much as the message does in a situation like this, and that ties back into why the bridges and power plants threat lands differently than a normal battlefield statement. This wasn't delivered by a commander standing next to hardware. It was delivered as a conditional warning routed through a semi-official channel, which puts just enough distance between the statement and the actual leadership that they can adjust their posture later without technically contradicting themselves. That's a classic escalation management move. Thread the needle between sounding tough enough to satisfy a domestic audience that wants to see resistance, while leaving enough wiggle room that if Washington actually does hit a bridge or a power plant tomorrow, Tehran isn't automatically locked into a nuclear-level regional response they can't actually deliver on. It's brinkmanship, but it's brinkmanship with an exit ramp quietly built into the wording. And that's worth remembering every time one of these statements goes viral online, looking like the scariest thing said all week. What do you think happens next? Do you think the United States actually goes all in on a coordinated bridges and power plants campaign? Or do you think this stays a rhetorical red line that both sides keep threatening, but neither one fully crosses? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I love seeing where you all think this is headed. And if you want the full breakdown behind everything we talked about today, the strategy, the decision-making, the way pressure actually gets applied in a fight like this, go grab that book using the link in the description. And if you want to stay on top of every twist in this war as it happens, get on that email list using the other link below. It's completely free and you'll never miss a beat. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next one.